Great. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the first session of our SET seminar. SET stands for Socio-Ecological Transition Seminars. This is the second year we're running this initiative. I'm not going to say too much because I'm going to just leave the floor to our host for today. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Roberta Dicetti. I'm a lecturer in Organization Studies at Bournemouth University, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this seminar series. So welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just going to leave the floor to Sarah, that is our host for today. Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you, Roberta. Good morning from my side to everyone, and thank you for attending. It is a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome to you to this seminar by SETS, organized by SETS. It's also great to see all you familiar and also new faces. Hopefully we will have an interesting and inspiring discussion. Before I give the floor to our keynotes, Philip, I would like to have a short introduction about SETS seminars, our plan for today, and our discussions. As we already informed you, SETS is a joint informative initiative between the research group on collective action, change and transition at the University of Trento in Italy, the Center for Sustainable and Socially Responsible Consumption at Bournemouth in UK, and the Environmental Sociology section at the Örebro University in Sweden. In the cycle of seminars, by inviting scholars from different perspectives and audiences from different categories, we try to reflect on socio-ecological transformation in times of crisis, with particular attention to the themes of sustainable consumption, moral economies, and decolonization. You can find more information about our future plans in the link that I will share in the chat bar. So for today, we have our first round, and we are very pleased to have Philip Balsiger as our keynote. Philip is a professor at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, and is a specialist in economics, sociology, and social movements. His research focuses mainly on the process of contestation in markets and social movements, ethical consumption practices, and digital economy. Philip will give us a talk about critical issues in the contemporary capitalized market related to his ongoing research project, The Value of Morality. According to his economic sociology perspective, he will argue about the fact that morality has increasingly become one of the ways through which value is created in a capitalized market. We are also very glad to have two discussants, Adam Standring and also Irina Aguiari. Adam is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at Montford University in the UK. He's an environmental sociologist, and his research concerns the politics of knowledge production in the construction of climate expertise, particularly in relation to IPCC. And Irina, she is PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy. In her current research, she is working on the practices of illicit intermediation of labor within the Italian agricultural sector. So for today, after this introduction, we have around 40 minutes for you, Philip, to present your work, and then maybe 20 minutes for our discussants to have their comments and suggestions, and then we open the floor for all audiences to have a joint discussion. Thank you so much, and Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me to the organizers of this seminar. I have a PowerPoint for my presentation that I want to show you. All right. So I wanted to start maybe with a little preliminary remark to guide your expectations with regard to my talk. So it's the SETS seminar on socio-ecological transition. I'm not sure that my talk really addresses such a transition. It's more an analysis and some sort of a critical comment maybe on the socio-ecological values as they are integrated into the dominant capitalist economy today. And with some reflections on what the relation of this is to a potential socio-ecological transition that I've tried to integrate towards the end of my talk. It's just for make sure you don't have the wrong expectations. I wanted to start by showing you this example of a pizzeria that recently opened in my hometown in Lausanne, a pizzeria that does the original pizza from Napoli. So that is based on a value proposition, you could say, about authenticity. But as you can see here, it talks about local ingredients and about the pizzeria durable. So that's a sustainable pizzeria. So this pizzeria says that it uses sustainable ingredients, locally sourced, organically produced flour from a mill next to the city, mozzarella made with milk from Swiss cows. So it has this idea that the pizza that they make, the main qualification or the quality of this pizza, it comes from this sustainable production that it uses. And I will refer to this kind of thing in my talk as moral valuation. So moral or morality here as a very kind of broad, encompassing criteria that embraces various social, environmental issues, grievances that have come to bear on markets, issues of sustainability, working conditions, animal welfare, etc. So these kinds of values that at first are outside of markets and become more and more criteria of evaluation and of the creation of value within markets, and have become, I would argue, a core component of contemporary capitalist markets. So what this idea, this question of moral valuation has much been addressed, I would say, under the angle of ethical or political consumption. There's a lot of literature on how consumers integrate ethical values in their consumption decisions. And in parallel, there's a lot of work on social movements and how they increasingly target companies, the consequences of this, the kind of contentiousness of markets we find. And my talk today will build on this work, but somehow enlarge it or try to bring it all together by adopting a perspective that is anchored in economic sociology, by looking at value as created in a social process of valuation. So I'm interested in developing this perspective as how morality becomes a form of valuation in markets. So it's a perspective, I would say, that promises to bring these different angles together in an overarching account of the value of morality in contemporary markets. How do products get moral qualities? What social, political, economic processes can explain this? Which products get them and which don't? What happens to moral qualities once they become part of market valuation? And does this moral valuation that has become a central form of valuation in contemporary capitalism, does it help or hinder broader processes of social change? These are more or less the question I will address. So the overview of my talk, I'll start by some theoretical considerations on morality and markets and the concept of valuation in particular, but I will go quite quickly through with this, and then I'll look at how this the forms this moral valuation takes in contemporary market, what moral valuation is made of, some like conceptual mappings that I propose, the values morality creates. I think I go through that or talk about that, and finally this idea of moral valuation and socio-ecological transformation. How does it go together? Does it go together? This is the final question. So let me start by some broad considerations on morality and markets. Could say that the dominant and conventional, or the conventional view, and maybe for a long time the dominant view, is that markets and morality are separate spheres. Markets may have their own morality, like strictly limited to the issues of efficiency, competition, profit. Other moral considerations are not supposed to be brought into markets. Maybe one way to illustrate this is by talking about Thompson's classic study of the moral economy of the English peasants in the 18th century. This study that showed how these peasants resisted the introduction of market mechanisms in the name of a more traditional moral economy based on long-held perceptions of just prices, of how goods of necessity should be distributed. That's what Thompson calls the moral economy. And here the moral economy is opposed to the capitalist market economy, which is precisely not moral. Now, economic sociology is interested in the social and cultural embeddedness of markets. And this includes the moral embeddedness of markets. So it takes kind of a different view. It will say that actually morality and markets goes together, but in various ways. And it will in particularly be interested in looking about how morality enables, limits, and accompanies markets in different ways. Probably the most well-known and maybe also the most important aspect about this is how morality limits markets. This is a perspective that is kind of compatible with Thompson's view. Here the idea is that certain spheres of life or certain goods are excluded from or are protected from markets. For example, because they're considered as sacred. For instance, organs, we don't want them to be exchanged in markets because we think that it's too important. It should not be submitted to market mechanisms. Or also maybe because we think that the market mechanisms would be harmful. A good example are labor markets, labor law, that is about protecting workers from the negative consequences of a free market, right? So we will limit, for instance, working hours, we will ban child labor, have minimum wages, these kinds of things. Or another example, environmental regulations. In many ways, how markets are limited by morality, social processes that bring in questions of morality to limit markets. Very often, of course, this is the result of struggles by social movements. The state plays an important role in this. The author most closely associated to the analysis of these kinds of dynamics is Polanyi, who analyzed the rise of capitalism and free markets as a struggle between these pro-market movements that seek to install free markets and the counter movements that seek to protect society from the harm of market expansion. But market limitation, and just to show you here, there's another example, this book, one of the main authors in economic sociology that is associated with studying morality and markets is Viviana Salazar, who has written a lot about this. But market limiting is not the only way of how morality is present in markets. Morality also accompanies markets. And here, moral contestation and moral claims take place directly in markets. Certain goods, products, brands are presented as particularly moral. The most telling examples are labels or certifications. For instance, fair trade labels, organic labels, sustainability. And here the market or certain offers in markets become moral. Morality becomes a basis for the creation of economic value, for distinction within markets. It's part of the value proposition one finds in markets. So here there's no longer an opposition between market economy and the moral economy. Morality is directly integrated into the market economy. We can term this moralized markets, markets where morality becomes an explicit criteria of differentiation and valuation. So I will use this, concept and this angle of valuation, this perspective, to understand the processes of how value is created in market. So the idea of valuation is to see value creation as a social process. We will look at how things, practices, persons, goods become valuable. And in this case, because I'm interested in markets, it's especially about goods, how goods become valuable in market. It's a constructivist perspective that says that value is created by attaching specific qualities to goods, qualities that are valued by customers in a specific way. And these values that integrate or become part of markets, or that become the basis for valuation in markets, can refer to different kinds of social values, aesthetic values, economic value, moral value, etc. So with these kind of values become the basis to evaluate things within markets. And the argument of my talk, as you have understood, I guess, by now, is that moral valuation is a characteristic form of value in contemporary capitalism. And to understand, one of the goals is to understand why and what are the processes behind this. It also implicates to look at the material equipment in markets to understand how actually this happens, how these moral values become integrated in markets, which is what I will do during this talk. So I come now to the more empirical part of the talk, although it's not like a conventional talk in the sense of I present a paper and a specific study. So I will more like give you some conceptual mapping, some illustration from studies I've done in the past. So it's not precisely speaking an empirical talk, but I will talk about empirical examples, of course, but not a specific study idea. So I'm going to try to draw a little bit the different components of what moral valuation is made of to start. So let's first think about the different actors of moral valuation. So here I try to present this on this slide. So what you see here is that, well, we could say there's a broad variety of actors that are part of this moral valuation. You see social movements that are important actors for this, that bring in these moral values into markets in different ways. We have here on this slide, I put some actors like labels. Don't we have, for instance, fair trade labels, labeling organizations. Here we have something that is part both of social movements and of the capitalist economy. I put this pizzeria here, which could be an actor of this moral valuation, right? So this is, I mean, part of the capitalist economy, but it's a small, very small company, right? So it's not like a transnational, multinational company, shareholder company. It's just a very small company, but obviously what can be also actors of moral valuation can be transnational companies, like here, for instance, Snickers. And you have other labels. And then also, I think what is important that part of this moral valuation, you both have what you could call the capitalist economy, but you also have the alternative economy, which I would say is pretty much part of social movements. And part of the alternative economy is kind of related to the capitalist economy, like at the margins, at the borders, the two go together. Think of social enterprises, think of labels, these kinds of things. And then you obviously have a large part that is really the capitalist economy, where a lot of this moral valuation takes place, either let's say either in interaction and maybe in close relation to social movement, but obviously not necessarily so. The state is also an important actor here in this. Some of these labels, for instance, will be closely related, connected to the state. I didn't put it into this slide to not make it more complicated, and I will not talk a lot about the state, but of course it also plays a role. I will mostly focus on this capitalist economy part and not so much talk about the alternative economy during today. What are the objects of this moral qualification? Sorry, there's some noises here on my side. Maybe I'll quickly go close the window. Sorry about that, but I had some like construction close by. So what are the objects of moral qualification? Very often the objects of moral qualifications are products. It's an actual product that will be morally qualified, that gets qualifications in terms, for instance, of organic, fair trade, local, etc. It will be attached to specific products. So here I try to qualify this. You can, on the left, you see products can be morally qualified or they can be not morally qualified. And the other thing that is also often object of moral qualifications are sale points, shops, but not necessarily just shops, where you actually purchase the product. Can be morally qualified or not. Now, you have these cases where the products are morally qualified, but not the place where people buy them. For instance, in a supermarket, you can find organic produce, fair trade, etc. Right? These often labeled products. Here you have a case in point where it's just the product that is morally qualified. Very often the two go together. The shop is morally qualified, is seen as something particularly moral, but also the product you buy there. An organic store, or the specialized store, a co-op. Generally in the alternative economy, usually the two go together, right? It's both a morally qualified sale point and the products you buy there are morally qualified. Another example I gave here from the digital economy, where more and more you also find these kind of processes. Airbnb, for instance, which is supposed to be a fair cooperative alternative to Airbnb, where both the actual the platform, let's say, is morally qualified, seen as like a place where you only have morally qualified products. All the places you will find there will be kind of fairer, right? But you also have places where it's only the sale point that is morally qualified and not actually the things you buy there. For instance, in the book market, this is the case. Yeah, you have independent bookstores that are seen as better, right? It's a better alternative, more moral alternative, which compared, for instance, to Amazon. But the books you buy are the same. You buy the exact same products. They don't have any specific qualification. Could say the same about a bakery, maybe, or a flower shop, or a local delivery service, and maybe a local competitor to Uber that will have the same kind of restaurants on it, but they have better conditions. So you would find the same offer, but you would not have morally qualified products there. So it's just the sale point that is morally qualified. So this is another way to try to make some order into this moral valuation in markets. Now, I told you in the beginning that I take quite a broad view here of what morality relates to. A broad understanding as social, environmental values that get connected to the production, the selling, the consumption of goods. So probably the main kinds of issues that are related to that, moral issues that are integrated into markets today, are all the environmental issues, are issues that are related to kind of the social aspects, working conditions, salaries, fair trade, these kinds of things. You also have a lot of issues that are related to animal welfare, but you can think of many others. There's generally issues that are related to specific social movements that connect their grievances to the economy. And then within these broader categories, for instance, the environment, so here the green issues, you have many different sub-kinds, many different specific things that they refer to. All the question of organic, sustainable as a very broad category, much more specific things like energy efficiency, circular economy, no packaging, recycling, local. So you have a very broad variety of different categories that then can be put into these broader moral issues. So we have a big diversity, and if we look at specific markets, we'll also see that the kinds of moral issue one finds within markets, it varies a lot. It will differ a lot from one market to the other. It will reflect specificities of the market, but also of particular social processes. There is not any systematic analysis of this. I did a study quite a long time ago already now, where we looked with a colleague from Germany, we looked at the ethical fashion market in UK and Germany to see what kind of movement issues the producers within these markets refer to. And so we looked actually at the websites and tried to figure out what kind of issues they refer to. And we saw that overall, overwhelmingly, they refer to two kinds of things: the environment and social justice issues. So red and green kind of categories. We found a very similar picture in this study between what happens in Germany and what happens in the UK. And we found very few other issues that are also present in these markets, like animal welfare, a critique of fast fashion, but overall it was very similar. But if we were to look at other markets, we would find different issues. For instance, I did another study on the egg market, where obviously, I mean, it seems quite obvious, the animal welfare issue is quite present, but also the issue of the environment, since you find a lot of organic production of eggs, so you also have this aspect. But for instance, there's almost nothing in this market, or maybe even nothing about the working conditions. Similarly, I think if we look, for instance, at produce, fruit and veggies, now I don't have any study there, it's really just anecdotal, and I think it might be interesting to actually study this empirically. I would say we find a lot about the environment, obviously a lot local, organic, but we won't find a lot about social conditions of productions, for instance, farm workers in the countries of Southern Europe or things like that, except for fair trade, obviously, where we have this aspect. Now, of course, there will also be a lot of variation from not only from one market to the other, but also depending on in which country we look at this. It will not be the same. There are also some markets where we find very little moral valuation of this kind. For instance, I don't know if you've already tried to buy a hammer or a screw that is fair trade, or that is has some moral qualification. I think that's impossible to find. There is no differentiation along such issues, no product qualifications along these lines in this market. So there are markets that are totally outside of this. So there's a lot of variety here with regard to the kind of moral valuation that we find, which reflects processes of qualification and valuation that are socio-political processes. We could look at this at the level of markets, and I will keep this level of analysis for a little while, for a little longer, but we could obviously also look at it at the level of specific producers, specific companies, for instance, to see also how they differentiate each other from each other with regard to this. Another way to think about it is to have this kind of a market as public arenas idea. Think of it in these terms. Say that the economy is kind of a public arena where certain issues become reflected. It requires the work of moral entrepreneurs that will bring such issues on the agendas of these markets, and then they will get addressed in these markets. They will become maybe institutionalized, and they will either, like, when they become institutionalized, they might stay in these markets, or they might not become institutionalized and they might disappear again. Or maybe other things become institutionalized and will then make certain other moral qualities more and more marginal. Now, this is not at all an empirical finding that I show here. It's just some illustration of how we could think of it. Here, we could think of the clothing market, for instance, where we have two broad issues that are, as I showed before, are mostly present. The question of social justice, particularly conditions of production, and the question of the environment. It's mostly about organic cotton, labeled cotton, that will be one of the main way how clothes are get moral qualities. Now, I didn't study this in detail, but I did some studies on the clothing market. And one thing that you could certainly see is that how the production conditions was the original thing, actually, the original moral issue that was put on the agenda of these markets. But more and more, it's the sustainability aspect that becomes more and more present. There's trends, there's fashion, there's new things that come up. I tried to represent it here, that suddenly we will see it possible to, for instance, measure the carbon footprint of particular clothes. There's the whole idea of the circular economy that will become something and then will emerge and take up space in these markets. There's also the question that some things, as I said, will become institutionalized. For instance, there's labels that are developed, and then it becomes something that is quite easy to adapt for new producers or for producers in the market. The easiest way to get a moral quality in this market is just to purchase organic cotton. And so this will be something that has quite a good chance of spreading because it becomes actually a product here. The morality becomes a product. It's labeled cotton that you can purchase on the market, and you will get this moral quality. So we could think about it in these terms, right? What are the how is moral valuation created on markets? One way of thinking about it is to say that they're created through what economic sociologists call market devices. Market devices are part of the equipment of markets that is developed to differentiate, qualify products, compare, evaluate products by brands, by sellers, etc. And different kinds of market devices contribute to create the value of morality in markets. There's what we call judgment devices that create new moral criteria to evaluate products. For instance, social movement campaigns that will denounce certain companies and that will evaluate them according, for instance, to environmental criteria. The work of Sophie Dubuisson-Kellier showed this very nicely with regard to environmental criteria and NGO campaigns. Then there's what we can call accountability devices, which are devices that, for instance, certification schemes, labels that actually somehow freeze morality into standards. They get translated into concrete rules. Morality gets translated into certain rules. It gets measured. It gets verified. These kinds of standard certification, etc., are a way how morality becomes a part of markets, and probably the main way we can say. And there's also what we could call simply marketing devices, packaging, messages that we find in markets. try to go on a little bit. Just one last, this is the last slide of this part of how does morality, the forms that morality takes in markets. I said that one way that it becomes visible in market is what we could call moral messaging, which is more and more, I would say, also present in markets. Now, here I try to show how, so we have moral messages, markets, brands, companies will refer to moral issues in their communication. And so I put this here on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, I put moralized practices, so the actual practices of companies that can be related sometimes to, they said, to for instance, to moral standards, for instance, through certifications. Now, very often labels, for instance, they're both a form of messaging and a practice, right? It's a certain, you adopt a certain practice to get labeled, but at the same time, it's a message towards consumers, right? You show this label towards consumers. There's some labels that are not necessarily very much related to actual messaging directed to consumers. Standards, for instance, for fabrication, certain labor standards that are actually very little, not much visible towards consumers. But often you have what I call connected messaging, where you could say that the messaging, the moral messaging, goes together with moralized practices. But you also have a very broad category that you could call non-connected messaging, where you have moral messages on market that are not connected to any kinds of moralized practices. So these are these combinations that I put here on the top, the bottom right of this graph. Such types of moral messaging are often circumstantial. That means that the companies will present themselves as allies or supporters of certain moral goals. That's nothing to do with their actual practices. For instance, think of this example that I gave before of Snickers that put a rainbow on their packaging. So certainly it's like an ally or a supporter of the LGBTQ movement, which is not necessarily something that reflects any kind of practice of Snickers. It's just to jump on some kind of movement at a specific moment in time. Or here, this is an example that maybe you have heard of, an ad that Pepsi did during the Black Lives Matter movement that was very controversial, because precisely this kind of non-connected messaging is not only circumstantial, but also often opportunistic. It has nothing to do with actual practices and just tries to use a movement to sell something. And it can be also, in certain cases, misleading, that it actually shows something that does not correspond at all to practices or is contrary to the actual practices of a company. A common definition of greenwashing refers to this kind of moral messaging. So this is maybe certainly a very present way of how moral valuation is present in market, but it's not the only one, right? We also have these forms of connected messaging. The politics of moral messaging comes especially from this gap that you can see between moral practices and moral messages. And it's a consequence, I would say, of the very broad presence of this moral messaging today in market. There's obviously a very big critical literature on this, about especially about the greenwashing phenomenon. A strong critique from social movements in academia that companies just present themselves in a certain light, use morality to sell, but it's not related to practices. But there's also an interesting, more recent phenomenon that's a critique of moral messaging in markets that is not about inconsistencies, but on the contrary, accuses companies as having become too political, as having become left-wing or woke, as it says in this book here that was written by a famous American investor. It's a kind of a backlash of moral capitalism that comes from the shareholder activists, those who say that companies should just be about making money and not about anything else, and that actually bringing in these stakeholder interests, right, is a problem, and that companies should just look at the interests of their shareholders, the value of their stocks. And increasingly more and more today, but especially in the USA and a little bit maybe in the UK, this is also related to the conservative movement. This criticism of capitalism as woke, as promoting liberal values. I think it's interesting because you really have a critique from all kinds of sides, actually, of this forms of moral valuation in capitalist markets today. Okay, let me look at, I have like maybe 10 more minutes. So I tried to speak about the two other parts that are a little shorter in the 10 minutes that I have left. So I wanted to say something about what kinds of values this morality actually creates. There's different meanings of value that we can find. There is value in this economic sense, in the sense of the price. For economists, value is the price, is monetary value. In economic sociology, the idea is to bring in or to look actually at how different kinds of values, social values, inform economic value. Often we're interested in looking at these interrelations. So how, for instance, social values as the environment, social justice, animal welfare, how it relates to economic value. This relationship can be complex and sometimes counterintuitive. Things that are seen as very valuable, that have a lot of worth, very worthy, might precisely be priceless, have no economic value. This could be through this way that we say that they are very valuable. It's impossible to give them a price. Sometimes we say that we just give it a symbolic value of $1 because it's so worthy. But in other examples, it is precisely by giving a very high price to something that it will express also its social values. Now, how does it work in the case of moral valuation? What is the monetary value of the moral issues that become expressed in markets? Very generally speaking, we can say that very often moralized products, labeled goods especially, are more expensive. They have higher prices. And the common explanation is to say that moral goods are more costly. They respect higher standards. This creates costs, which are reflected in the price. It's a sort of augmented labor theory of value. But we also know from economic theory and sociology that prices do not just reflect the cost of the production process, of course. But nonetheless, I would say it's an interesting argumentation, especially also because it often reflects the positions of the moral entrepreneurs that try to change the way things are produced and to bring in these moral values into market. They actually generally argue that conventional production, the standardized, globalized, industrialized form of production, does not reflect the true costs in terms of, for instance, what economists call externalities, right? That it harms the environment or animals, etc., and that it does not reflect the true costs. And often these social movement actors, moral entrepreneurs that bring these kinds of values into markets, they want moralized products to be more expensive. They say that the price should reflect the true value. It should be fair. For instance, this strong stance, I saw it in interviews I recently did with ethical fashion entrepreneurs, where there's a whole debate about the question of sales. Should there be discounts on ethical fashion products, ethical clothes that they produce? For instance, at the end of the year or at certain moments in the year where there's sales, should they also use this? And very often they are very much against it because they say it should precisely not, it's not something they should use because it will socialize people into not valuing products enough. So they refuse to put their products on sale. So we have this kind of a relation, but at the same time, there's also criticism of the higher prices of moral products. The argument that this makes the products kind of elitist and accessible only to affluent consumers, and related that the companies actually who have these products, they take advantage of it. They take advantage of the fact that the consumers who buy this kind of things have higher purchasing power, and so they will pay higher prices. So companies just like sell them for a higher price. And the problem is that it makes it even more or even less likely that it will, let's say that also, that it will become mainstream, that all kinds of consumers can buy them. So it means that it's not just that these products are more expensive, but also that, for instance, supermarkets will take actually advantage of it, and that the actual value, the monetary value, the higher value monetary value that this moralization creates doesn't go to the producers, doesn't go to the, doesn't benefit the environment, for instance, but benefits who? It just benefits the supermarket chain or a company. So the question here is the distribution of this value. Now, monetary value is not the only value that moral valuation in market creates. It also creates different kinds of symbolic values. We saw that consumers are willing to pay higher prices also because moral products create symbolic value in terms of status. Consumers gain status by purchasing moralized products. For instance, by buying locally grown produce, riding a bike, by wearing Veja sneakers, these kind of things. Now, this is specific to certain kinds of milieus. It's not in all kinds of social groups that this will lead to status gains. It's mostly the middle class. It's not the most wealthy, where status usually derives still from more like overconsumption, conspicuous consumption, luxury consumption. It's also not in the working class that are more directed towards material consumption, but it's mostly in these highly educated middle classes. So in many ways, seems to fit very well into Bourdieu's framework of consumption distinction related to cultural capital. It has become one of the ways that the cultural elite distinguishes itself from economic elite. Many people have worked on this, have shown this. Johnston, for instance, and also Magnus Bostrom and Michael Klintman in a recent piece where they talked about this. So on the consumer side, it creates this kind of symbolic value, and also on the producer side, on the side of companies, it can create status for companies, but more broadly, I would say it creates legitimation. It serves the purpose of justifying, legitimizing economic action, or even capitalism at large. Say, speaking about putting forward forms of moral valuation is a mode of responding to the critique of contemporary movements about globalized capitalism's harmful consequences. Moral valuation puts forward the fact that companies can and will deal with this. It positions capitalism, big companies, finance, etc., as the actors who are in charge, who will solve this problem, who have solutions for it. So the symbolic value that moral valuation creates for company is mostly legitimation. The argument I make here is close to Boltanski and Chiapello's argument of the new spirit of capitalism, that actually capitalism, companies will use the critique they get to create new forms of justifications. And I think here we really have this kind of phenomenon where we have all these long-standing critiques since the new social movements about environment, about social globalized economy, etc. And companies kind of like develop new forms of valuation that relate to this kind of critique directly. All right. So the very last part is the question of the prospects of moral valuation for socio-ecological transformation. Many observers would see the integration of moral values into capitalist market as the way forward in order to make the economy more sustainable, more fair, more equal. This is especially up the point of view and the position of big chunks today of the corporate and financial elites. As an example here, a book by the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, book that advocates for capitalism that takes into account social and environmental values, advocates for stakeholder capitalism, for purposeful companies, the integration of environmental and social and governance criteria into finance decision, to direct financial flows, etc. So even the title here, you see values, building a better world for all. It's really about bringing in these different values. So they see this as the way forward, as actually the way that we will achieve a socio-ecological transition, if you will. But other observers see it more critically. I just want to maybe bring in 2 or 3 arguments with regard to the problems we see. The first thing has to do with the actual factual improvements of moral valuation. What is its impact on environmental or social conditions? For instance, very specifically of labels of certification, does it actually improve something? Now, there is no overall answer to this, but there is a lot of criticism about the impact of specific labels, certifications, that they do not really achieve what they claim to. A lot of criticism from the NGO world, from academia, from NGOs. Here, for instance, a report by Greenpeace on certification in forestation. And there's also a lot of criticism from academic literature that seeks to actually measure the impact of certification. For instance, you can find a very recent piece about certification standards and their impact. And these kinds of literature usually shows a very mixed picture, that there is some impact, but there is also a lot of things that don't work well, and that there are positive and negative impacts. Here it's mostly a case-by-case picture. So we look at the specific certification and what kind of impacts does it have? But we can obviously also develop a critique that is much more systemic. And there, I would say the main issue is that even if we admit that moral valuation can bring real improvements, which as we've just seen is not necessarily the case, it still remains that we have a niche phenomenon, a kind of a moral bubble within a capitalist system that keeps to do more or less business as usual. And well, we could say, well, maybe it's not a bad thing as long as often social change starts in a niche and then it will spread beyond it. But it's not sure that this will actually happen. On the one hand, it's the problem, or is what many have shown about this issue of the side of consumers, the focalization on improving consumption that is problematic, the idea that it's just about doing good for oneself, about status mechanisms, and that it will remain in the bubble then. So it's kind of a moral bubble that gives absolution to people who are already interested in this anyways, and it will not really make a broader change of the economy. And on the side of companies or of capitalism and its structural forces, we find a similar problem. Mechanisms that are in the hindering, you could say, broader social change. You could say what moral valuation does is could be called spotlighting. A spotlight is put on the improved parts of capitalism, the parts where it takes care of its externalities, where it seeks to amend the problems it creates. But by doing this, the rest is kept in the dark. Even if what actually happens under the spotlight is indeed better, if there are improvements, it doesn't necessarily change anything that is done on the side. For instance, producing ethical fashion for conscious consumer doesn't make fast fashion go away. The spotlight is on these green parts, but nobody looks on the brown parts, the dirty part. So I would say that a lot of the discussion is often about the question of greenwashing, which I think is important, but I would argue that this question of spotlighting, it's not quite the same as greenwashing, right? It doesn't mean that there can be improvements there, and these companies actually often there are parts of the capitalist economy even that has changed with this regard, but the focus on these kinds of aspects takes away interest or focus on the other aspects that haven't changed. So I come to the conclusion. I hope I convinced you that these kinds of moral valuation are very present in markets today. hope to have shown you a little bit the different forms they take. Maybe 3 points here just to conclude. The idea that moral valuation is at least certainly one of the main contemporary forms of capitalist justification. I would also, I didn't really talk about this much or not at all during this talk because I had to limit myself a bit, but I would say it very much corresponds also to a particular time, to this area of neoliberal deregulated capitalism. We have actually, it's quite interesting because we have a time of market expansion. Neoliberalism is very much defined by an expansion, an ever bigger expansion of markets. Well, at the same time, we have this rise of this accompanying morality in markets. So it really goes, these two things really go together. And the last point that I think is important is that I think there is definitely a limited potential for social change of this kind of moral valuation in markets. Now, I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you. And I'm sorry for taking up a little bit too much time.
Thank you, Philip. It was super interesting, and I am very fascinated how you have meticulously studied the subject. Thank you so much. So I open the floor for our discussion. Maybe Adam, would you like to start with your suggestions and comments or questions? And then we have Irina. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to speak on this, and thank you, Philip, for the very interesting presentation. I'd read the paper that was circulated around, so the presentation that you gave helped to clarify some of the points that I'd already jotted down and made some of them a little bit more obscure, perhaps. I'll just make 2 or 3 brief points, and just so everybody else can have a chance to come in, and maybe I can come back at the end if there's time, if there's anything else to be said. But the first big point, I mean, it's really good. There's this big kind of rediscovery of morals within sociology, social sciences, and broader sense, which I think this makes a great contribution to. And when I read the paper compared to the presentation today, I was wondering where the issue of moral economy was coming from, because it was going to make an appearance, or should have made an appearance. So it was good to see it make an appearance here. One issue I have with this is that perhaps I have a slightly different reading to yourself on this, but I'm coming to moral economy through kind of contemporary authors such as Andrew Sayer, sociologists like Andrew Sayer and Lindsay Mahui, political economists who are using this as well now. And kind of one of the defining features of this that I take from this and I use in my own work is this not collapse, but this critique of the idea of neutral markets, of a neutral economy. The morals are imbued all the way through markets, and it's something that you kind of allude to in passing in the paper that was presented. But then I'm still not 100% clear where you yourself stand on this, because the illusion is always this distinction between moral markets and amoral markets or neutral markets. So are we supposed to imagine that neutral or objective or amoral, however, markets do exist, and moralizing them imbues them with certain kind of qualities or features? And then connected to that, in your presentation, you are explicit in saying that your conception of the moral is quite broad, whereas this is my reading, your conception of markets is relatively narrow, focusing principally on consumer goods and how consumer goods are exchanged. I have some difficulty with this because I think in doing so that you actually lose a lot of the potential explanatory power of morals. I think that it would benefit for something that was more kind of explicit and more tied down. And the recent work on moral economies, which looks at, kind of rejects this idea of economies as alienated spaces or self-interested actors and so forth. And I mean, Andrew Sayers' work, where he kind of one of the benefits of including morals in his conception of the economy and how the economy functions is precisely this rejection of calculation of one particular form of rationality and the opening up to multiple forms of rationality, of evaluative rationality. And so that's kind of another question really I have as well. And within this conception of morals, which is quite broad, I mean, is there a distinction between the understanding of moral valuation or something like just a normative judgment? These are not just normative judgments that are being made as well. When I'm thinking about morals and how I use morals in my own work and how I read it used in other sociological works, it's something that intimately brings in, and this is an advantage of it, brings in questions of narratives, of framings, of identity, of cognitive spheres. You do mention boundary work as well, but this is something that's very important, I think, as well. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. But I think there's something that could be, there's potential there that I feel could be explored further in this work. And then a final point before I pass over to somebody else. As I said, this is applied to the specific case of goods, some services. You mentioned some services, but this kind of consumer products. Could this idea of moral valuation be applied to precisely those things where people make a moral critique and reject marketization? So even before it becomes to a market, this kind of fight amongst certain social movements, certain social actors, to reject the marketization of particular services, spheres of social relations, and so forth. That's a huge part of moral critique of moral economy. Could it also be applied there as well? I'm thinking things like care, education, medicine, so forth. I mean, do you see a potential for this beyond consumer goods as well? So they're the very quick 3 points that I wanted to make.
Philip, would you like to?
Should I respond now?
Yes,
all right.
yes.
Thank you very much for your comments. I'm not sure I can respond to all of them. Let me just see. The first one, yeah, this question of the reference to the moral economy. Is there actually a non-moral economy or a neutral market, etc.? This is a tricky question as soon as you start using this lens of morality, indeed. And there are many different ways of using it. And maybe one of the reasons also why I did not initially use the moral economy concept is because it is so related to these debates too, because there's like totally different ways of using the moral economy concept between Thompson and then Scott and then other people in anthropology that used it. Anyways, but in the paper I sent you, which is quite different from the talk I gave, I know, but in the paper actually, one of the things, I mean, my point is really that it doesn't exist. There's always morality in markets, and there's no markets that are neutral, and even like efficiency and can be seen as some moral issue, right? So I totally would not want to make this impression, and that's why I use the term moralized markets in the paper rather than moral, because most people started using the category of moral markets, especially in organization studies. It's become a field of study, and for me it's a bit problematic because it makes this idea that others are not moral. And I wanted to point at the specific processes that will moralize markets, but I don't know if it's much more clear. I mean, I tried to make this argument in the paper, but yeah, this is a bit of a tricky issue. The second question, I mean, I also agree that I mean, in a way, obviously you can have very many different questions you can ask and many different ways of looking into how morality can be found in markets, right? All kinds of, as you said, normative judgments that are made in markets, but have actually nothing to do with the specific processes. Also, I talk about now that are really related to specific movements. So to be quite honest, in a way, it's sometimes almost just it's kind of a convenient category to bring these different forms of contestation and what they create in markets together by just referring to them as moral. But I say it's a broad view, but it's also actually a narrow view of morality because it leaves out many other moral issues that one also finds in markets. So yeah, it's a bit of a and then yeah, so obviously you could look at much more into other aspects, like you said, narratives, framings. Yeah, I think, but so I kind of agree with that point, right? That it becomes a bit of a narrow approach, but it's also, it shows some things, right? But maybe it doesn't obviously do everything you could do with the moral approach to markets. And the last point, I think it can be related, in my view, this moral valuation, to the rejection or the movements against marketization. It is sometimes directly related to protect certain aspects, but I think in the examples you mentioned, care, education, I mean, I feel like it could potentially become a way of like legitimizing these kinds of markets, right? You could have certain market devices that would put forward certain aspects to make, for instance, the marketization of education more legitimate. So I think it can be a way of like the advocates for marketization could use moral valuation to make the pill pass, in a way, to make sure that it will go. So we find this a little bit in these contests about moral contests about marketization. But then I would say in the examples you gave, again, it could be also that we find very different moral issues. Then it's not so much about workers' rights or environment, but it could be much more about, I don't know, protection of patient rights, or, you know, so it could be very different issues. But I would say that the angle of moral valuation, we could expand it and be like, okay, in different markets, we might find, and especially in these kinds of a bit peculiar markets that are public-private markets, we maybe find very different issues that become forms of moral valuation. And then also of distinction between different service providers, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam and Philip. Irina, this is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Philip, and everyone here for having me and for the talk. I think you very much succeeded in bringing the concept of morality down to earth and giving some practical examples of what you were talking about, that for someone that, like me, is no expert in this topic, was very much useful. Many of the points I wanted to touch have already been mentioned, and so I'll just try to present some big points, big thoughts that I'm having. The first one may be maybe on the sidelines of this conversation today, because, as I said, being no expert of these literatures or topic either, and coming from literatures of social movements and the study of somehow similar experiences, but from different perspectives, the very notion of morality seemed quite slippery to me, and also to some point difficult to employ in through different literatures, and for example, looking at how social movements engage in this process of evaluation. So I guess this is a question directed to you, but also to larger audience today. Like, how do you see the very notion of morality interacting with existing theories and social movements and their participation in markets? And this was particularly triggered by the fact that I would say, especially in the paper you circulated, some social movements appeared as the you named it the purists, and I would say kind of extremists, just in the sense of being in a very specific position of the spectrum you represented. Well, for example, in social movement literature, there is quite, I would say, a lively debate about whether and how those social movements that are interacting in neoliberal markets as a way of political action are actually achieving political outcomes, and to what extent they are in fact politicized or not. So I found some kind of contradictions maybe there. And more specifically into the topic of your talk, I was very interested by the fact that you would define valuation and morality as a relational processes. And yet somehow I found that in the conclusions you draw from this, these interactions were somehow not so much investigated. And specifically, I'm referring to the fact that it seemed to me that some kind of step before was missing in the whole discussion. That is, how can we talk about one morality when in fact, as you referred, there are many struggles among many different actors involved in these markets that have different moralities. And as a consequence, how different moralities are kind of selected, how some of them are successful in moralizing markets and some are not. For instance, in the empirical case you provide about free-range eggs, I was thinking about the fact that there would be movements, for example, vegan or anti-speciesism movements that would not consider that as a moral stance, the fact that animals are out of cages, that would be considered actually morally wrong, because they would advocate for not consuming animal products at all. So kind of how do you account for this kind of relations in your analysis? And to what extent you consider the power relations that intercore among actors involved in moralizing the valuation of markets? And connected to this point, I was thinking that even though today you concluded in saying that these processes are part of a capitalist project of self-justification, the determinist action of structures in, again, determining what kind of morals get to the market and get to influence the markets was partly missing. And I'm thinking, for example, not only in the example that Adam was providing about services, but just even with products, there are products that are highly moralized, as you mentioned throughout your presentations, but yet there are some that don't get to that point, or they get to that point in weaker forms. I don't know, think about female sanitary pads, or just about food. That is probably the example of an essential good that is highly privatized worldwide and controlled by a couple of corporates around the world, and yet how does it get moralized in very specific niche ways, as for organic foods or whatever else? And as some kind of a vicious circle, also how this structure, how capitalist structure influence moralizing tools. So, for example, how the labels or the labeling strategies that you mentioned sometimes are highly criticized for impacting small producers first, and to reproduce those power relations that are ingrained in neoliberal markets. So this would be my initial thoughts.
Yes, Philip.
Thank you. You too. Very great comments. I agree with what you say. I think, I mean, I probably didn't go so much into the actual processes, etc., but I try maybe to give a little more of if I get a little bit more into this in the short answer I want to give you. Okay, the first thing you asked, wait, about how movements. Definitely, there's a debate within movements. Yeah, should we engage with capitalism? Should we collaborate, etc.? I think, I mean, the idea of the moralized markets perspective was to show precisely that you have different conceptions often within social movements, where actors pursue different strategies with regard to that. So maybe I didn't really understand this point, how you see it as a contradiction, but for me it is just the idea that social movements are these like often very diverse, and you have all kinds of positions and strategies, and that they disagree about this, and some of them are against collaborating, and then you often have NGOs that are very much about, they advocate these kinds of strategies. So I'm not sure, maybe just I didn't understand the question well. And then how we talk about morality, or why do some issues get integrated and others don't, why some are selected and others are not. I think I didn't have time to say so much about that, but it's definitely an ongoing struggle. And I think some of these, as you said, I mean, there's new issues that come up, there's new interpretations that develop that, for instance, will lead even whole social movements or parts of social movements to like completely reevaluate previous moral judgments, right? For instance, this whole idea of, yeah, should we even hold chickens in even as free-range chickens? And then, or there's a whole debate now about is organic meat actually not worse than standard meat, and the only way is to not produce any meat, right? So there's like things that seem moral now, even for maybe now today or 20 years ago, for even the most radical social movement actors, might not seen as no longer moral 20 years later, because there's a sort of re-evaluation going on. And which one gets elected and which ones don't. I mean, it's definitely related to interactions between movements and companies, to questions of which ones are easier to put in place, which ones are less costly, which ones do not necessitate changing much in the production process. There's all kinds of struggles with different actors that do have different kinds of power. So definitely that's very much part of the story. In the study I did on the eggs in Switzerland, for instance, that was very much an ongoing struggle, and the result of the struggle reflected these power dynamics too. Yeah, I guess that's also a little bit the last point. I think, I mean, for me, it's not so much a structural question in the very strong sense. I think it's related to specific processes too. I think some movements, social movements in the 70s especially, started to really politicize consumption, to specifically relate issues to questions of production and consumption, and others didn't. The feminist movement, for instance, didn't do that very much. Maybe it starts a little bit now, but so there, I mean, you could imagine that, like, the questions of equal pay, or the questions of how many women are in the management of a company, it could be part of like the moral valuation, but it's not visible at all. There's no really labels around that or these kind of things. But I think doesn't mean it's not possible. It reflects specific social processes that did take place or did not take place. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you, Philip, Adam, and Irina. Now we have almost 6 minutes for general discussion, and we have Anna with raised hand. Please, Anna. Hanna.
Hi, my name is Hannah Osman. I'm a principal lecturer in tourism and hospitality. I can't say that I'm familiar with the concept of moral valuation, but I find it extremely fascinating. So thank you very much for such inspiring presentation. I don't have thoughts to contribute to this, but I have questions in my head. And I teach consumer behavior, and I'm really interested in the notion of symbolic values. And I wonder if consumers have a really big role to play in driving the need of companies to embed some kind of a moral value system, perhaps just for the sake of it. So in the era of social media and such powerful, consumer trends, has the role of consumers in driving this been explored? So that's my question.
Do I answer or yeah?
Yes,
yes, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of work on the question of ethical consumption and how consumers, but often also consumer movements, movements that speak in the name of consumers or mobilize consumers or develop organize consumers, how they bring up these kinds of issues. So I would definitely, it has been explored, but I don't think the consumers as such are necessarily, I mean, they're very important actors in it, but they're not necessarily the initiators. So it's more movements or maybe companies themselves. Consumers usually don't act, they rarely act collectively that much, actually. They're mostly just acted by others, I would say, in my experience in the studies I did.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Alicia, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation and also for the discussion, which was very stimulating, and I think it already raised a few issues that I wanted to raise, so I won't ask them again. But I have 2 points. So one is, it really relates to the discussion, but I'm not sure whether it has been articulated as I was thinking. Whether it might be a problem or a danger to somehow put this overarching frame of moral economy or morality on issues and on stakes that are very differently articulated by different subjects. So, for example, if I think about social movements, in the great part of cases, if not all of them, I wouldn't really mobilize more of morality frame to understand their collective action, nor their claims. And also in everyday life, I mean, there are a number of reasons why people would engage in what you call moral consumption that might not be moral at all. I mean, some may be ethical, which is to me quite different from moral. Some might be even self-interest. So I mean, I wonder really whether also the political stakes that are there might be somehow obscured or blanketed over from this kind of very overarching frame that I don't know whether it is respondent to the subjects you are speaking of or about. First thing. And the second thing is, which is maybe it's not clear to me or it's just a clarification. I wonder what kind of theory of value you are actually working with. Is it a kind of marginalist theory of value, or because what I can't, what I didn't get from your presentation is also about, you know, also material processes that that feed into value, that create value. For example, where is labor in all of this? Material labor, cognitive labor, affective labor. In what role does it have in the creation of this, increase the value or process of valuation that is proper of moralized economies? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question. I use this term indeed in this overarching way. I agree that it's not necessarily how movements would see their actions often. They would say that we're not in the business of morality. We're not moral entrepreneurs. Of course, also a lot of the consumers do not necessarily see it like that. I agree with that. I would say that you can argue that these are all moral issues that come into markets. So that's why I use the term. I think you can use it in kind of as a conceptual way of grouping or categorizing these things together. Which doesn't mean that different individual actors necessarily see their practices or their actions, collective actions, as moral as such, right? But it's a way of distinguishing certain phenomenon within the economy through this label. I personally don't oppose moral strongly to political. I think there's a very strong link between moral and political. Moral processes, moral entrepreneurs can work in the political arena. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't see them as opposing things, right? So it doesn't mean because I speak of it more as moral that I mean that it is not political or that it is depoliticized, for instance. That's sometimes the way people use they oppose moralizing and politicizing. I wouldn't see it as such, but I wouldn't speak also of like the political value in markets. Wouldn't make much sense to call it like that, right? It's a bit also a question of, and the theory of value, it's a constructivist view of how value is created. So it's these different actors that together creates not at all economics view or a marginalist view. It's not, but it's also not the labor theory of value. So I saw that Adam posted this new book by on valuation, right? So kind of, you know, it's this kind of approach of this value as something that is socially constructed by different actors that intervene. And yeah, that's the fast answer.
It's a very interesting discussion, and maybe we can collect Mehdi and Roberta's questions, and then you can give a final discussion on it. Okay, Mehdi, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. It was a very, very good discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm coming from an economics background. And just for my introduction, I'm working at Bournemouth University. I teach economics at Bournemouth University. And so the way I see is that in a market it's not really very clearly defined in the discussion, but market is a place where buyers and sellers they do transaction goods and services. And so there, and is it possible to have, first thing is that morality, as you have seen, it's kind of like everywhere, and I don't see that you cannot have any like amoral transaction, because there will be always some kind of morality. Even when you are buying milks, you can say that milks are good for you, therefore you are buying it. So there is a morality even when you are buying goods. So maybe the biggest question is, when you have done the survey of morality in the market, but biggest question probably is to ask that what what type of morality should exist within the market. Again, coming from another example, like you mentioned, is that, so we have a morality that businesses should always make profit. Businesses should be aiming to make profit. That's the kind of morality, moral judgment coming from some famous economist. And also alternative to that is coming from the idea of social responsibilities, that no, businesses should be socially responsible. That's another morality statement. So which one actually should be selected, or shall we be making something different, relieving both of them? And that can be a big question, and whether that can be answered in the future. Yeah, that's my comment.
Okay.
And Roberta, can you please go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Philip and Irina, for the discussion. I'm going to keep my question short because we're running out of time. I was just wondering, Philip, what do you think about the advocacy activity that some of these labeling organizations and standard organizations carry out? Because I agree that the overall potential for change can be limited when we just think at labels and standards in terms of market devices, signaling virtue to a consumer. But I think when we take into account the broader activities that sometimes these organizations carry out in terms of advocacy and working with different actors, I think there might be more potential and scope for change there. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thank you. So I start with this question. For me, the main role of advocacy activity here is to put new issues on the agenda of markets, basically. So that's, I think, what these advocacy groups often do. They bring new issues to the agenda, and then starting from there, so it's often the initiation of the process. There will be developments of maybe what I call accountability devices, moral messages that become visible in markets. And then maybe the other important role of advocacy activity is often, once these kinds of markets and things exist, it's this like critical role to denounce, for instance, greenwashing, to do like a little bit watchdog and say, oh, so I think it's a very important role of this advocacy activity actually in these markets, also because it's there's no tribunal, it's the public or it's the consumer, so they can play a little bit this role of bringing in the critical view. So I would say advocacy organizations are very important. And I think it would be a good idea to bring them more in my overall in the overview I gave. And then the question by Mehdi, my point is that there is, I agree with you, there is morality everywhere. I would say that there is a kind of like a new morality, or partly a new moral economy that has risen over the past 50 years. And now I think there is a little bit of a struggle within like the financial and capitalist elites about, is it just about profit, or should it be also about something else? And moral valuation is on this side, where it should be also on, or the things I talked about are these like kind of new elites that say it should also be about something else. And so it's a little bit this new morality that has taken hold, I mean, that has become more and more present, I would say, in contemporary capitalism compared to like 50 years ago or something.
Okay, I don't see any hand raised, but if anyone else wants to add something, maybe we have just 2 minutes for more discussion and more comments. But I would like to say that for me personally, it was very interesting, and I learned a lot from your presentation, from your comments and questions as well. Hope you find it constructive and inspiring for your work. If there is no more comments, we can wrap up the discussion for today. Francesca, would you like to add something about? You are okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, no, just thank you very much. Was very interesting for me as well. I have understood much better all the overall all your arguments that I was following your work, of course, as you know. And well, just thank you very much. This is also a very good example of what we would like to have in these seminars. So such a lovely discussion that help everyone to have a much better, clear idea also about our own work. So thank you very much, Philip. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for the discussions and the discussion, because it was very extremely interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you also to all of you. It was very helpful. I'm trying to like bring the different thoughts I have on this and the different studies a bit together to do some sort of an overall account. So it was very good to have these feedbacks to like improve my view of this processes that I tried to show you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.